You book a flight, buckle your seatbelt, and trust that the human sitting in the cockpit actually knows what they're doing. But history has proven something terrifying. Sometimes the only thing flying the plane is pure, unfiltered stupidity. Welcome to Factoland, where today we're diving into the skies and straight into 9 pilot decisions so unbelievably dumb you'll wonder how these people ever passed the simulation. These aren't small mistakes like forgetting your luggage. No, these are crash a multi-million-dollar jet because you pressed the wrong lever levels of genius. Some pilots got lost. Some forgot critical checklists. Some attempted to land on runways that weren't even runways. And a few, well, let's just say the autopilot wasn't the only thing asleep. Strap in, tighten your tray tables, and maybe say a prayer. Because we're about to relive the dumbest pilots in history, the moments where aviation met pure human error and said, "No way this is actually happening." Let's begin. Number 1. Imagine you're on a long flight from Seoul to San Francisco. 10 hours, 2 meals, 3 bathroom visits. You're exhausted, dehydrated, and silently praying the guy in seat 34B never removes his shoes again. But finally, the plane begins to descend. Clear skies, no turbulence, calm winds, a perfect California landing day. You look out the window, the coastline sliding into view, and you have no idea that in the cockpit, no one is actually flying the plane. Well, technically someone is flying it. The problem is that all 3 of the pilots think that someone else, or something else, is doing it. This is Asiana Airlines Flight 214, a Boeing 747 gently gliding towards San Francisco International Airport at the exact same speed you scroll through TikTok at 3 a.m. Dangerously slow and with zero self-awareness. Inside the cockpit are 3 trained professionals, a captain who's new to the Boeing 777, an instructor who's supervising him, and a 3rd relief pilot just chilling behind them. A solid team on paper. In reality, this was the Avengers of Confusion. Here's the key detail. The runway's glide slope signal, the thing that normally helps guide the descent, was temporarily shut down for maintenance. Not unusual. Pilots are trained for this. But this crew approached the runway like the glide slope was optional DLC content they forgot to download. Now the captain believed the auto throttle, the system that controls airspeed, was maintaining speed. Unfortunately, the auto throttle was doing absolutely nothing. It was basically on vacation, yet no one noticed. The 777 continued drifting lower, slower and sadder, like a big metallic sigh. 3 sets of trained eyes, 2 flight displays, alarms everywhere. And nobody's paying attention to the giant speed number dropping like a crypto coin. At 500 feet, the aircraft is moving so slowly it's practically doing yoga. The plane starts begging. Stick shaker. "Hey, you're stalling!" Low speed alert. Please add power." Ground proximity. "Pull up, now." The pilots respond with the same energy as someone hitting snooze on their alarm. Maybe they thought if they ignored it long enough, the plane would fix itself. The captain finally tries to add power, but jet engines don't just snap awake. They spool up slowly, like a teenager being told it's time for school. And by the time those engines start waking up, the plane is already too low. At this point, passengers are looking out the window and thinking, "Wow, the water is really close. That's weird." Yes, it was weird. Because the Boeing 777 was seconds from kissing the seawall, the giant concrete barrier at the edge of the runway. And then, wham! The tail slams into the seawall so hard it rips off like Velcro. The fuselage bounces, skids, twists, and breaks apart in a cloud of smoke and debris. One wing disintegrates. The landing gear collapses. The cabin spins like a drunk Beyblade. Inside, chaos erupts. People screaming. Overhead bins popping open. Luggage everywhere. Slides deploying. Some passengers literally sprint across the runway barefoot. Miraculously, most people survive, thanks to modern engineering and extremely fast emergency crews. But the investigation? Oh, it was brutal. They found. The crew misunderstood the automation mode. The captain thought the auto throttle was engaged. It wasn't. No one manually monitored airspeed, no one called for a go-around, and the cockpit communication was so bad it could have been a group project in high school. When asked afterward why they didn't notice the airspeed dropping, one pilot said he assumed the plane would autocorrect. Autocorrect, like the plane was going to go, "Oh, you meant 137 knots?" and fix itself. My brother in Christ, this is not an iPhone. This is a 300-ton aircraft with 307 people on board. The final report labeled the cause: pilot error, mismanagement, and over-reliance on automation. In simple terms, they believed the plane was smarter than they were. Asiana 214 remains one of the most infamous examples of trusting the computer a little too much. Proof that sometimes the scariest thing about flying isn't turbulence or weather. It's the pilot looking at a blinking warning light and thinking, it'll sort itself out. Number 2. It's the middle of the night in Guam. Warm air, heavy clouds, visibility so poor even Google Maps would give up. Most people are asleep, except the flight crew of Korean Air Flight 801, a Boeing 747 full of passengers who just want to land, get off the plane, and not be part of aviation history. It's August 6, 1997, a perfectly normal commercial flight, operated by a cockpit having a very not normal day. The approach into Guam is tricky on a good day. Tonight, it's one step away from a horror movie. The glide slope, the vertical guide for landing, has been out of service for months. There are giant NOTAM notices everywhere, like, "Hey pilots, don't use this, it's off." But here's the problem. Just because a sign says "don't push this button" doesn't mean someone won't push the button. Korean Air 801 begins descending toward the island, slicing through clouds so thick it feels like the Boeing 747 is swimming. Inside the cockpit, the captain is tired, very tired. The first officer is hesitant and quiet. The flight engineer is doing his best impression of a background extra. In crew resource management terms, this is what we call a walking disaster recipe. The captain briefs the approach like the glide slope is working. It is not working. It has not been working. It will not magically work. But the captain continues, as if the invisible glide slope ferry is guiding them safely to the runway. Now, aviation has this thing called minimum descent altitude, the lowest point you can go without seeing the runway. If you go below it, well, you better be ready to meet something solid. The Boeing descends and descends way past where it should. Guam ATC says cleared for visual approach, which is hilarious because the pilots cannot see a single thing outside, just darkness and cloud soup. Inside the cockpit, warning alarms are preparing their resignation letters. You know those GPS apps that go, "Turn left, turn left, turn left." The aircraft is doing that, but instead of turn left, it's saying, "Terrain, terrain, whoop whoop, pull up." The captain, he responds like someone hitting "remind me later" on an update alert. He thinks the plane is lined up. He thinks he's descending correctly. He thinks everything is fine. And he is wrong about everything. Spectacularly wrong. The Boeing 747 continues descending toward Nimitz Hill, a big chunk of elevated terrain west of the airport. A well-known hazard, painted on every chart, highlighted in every approach briefing. One small problem. Tonight, Korean Air 801 is flying straight into it like it owes them money. At 660 feet above ground, ground proximity warning system goes full drama mode. Sync rate, whoop whoop, pull up. Everyone in the cockpit hesitates. The first officer tries to hint something is wrong. "Check your altitude, sir." The captain, Yeah. Narrator voice, "No, not yeah. At 300 feet above ground, still in solid cloud cover, the cockpit is confused. The instruments are screaming, and the aircraft is now way below where any airplane should be at this distance. You know that feeling when you miss a highway exit and your GPS reroutes you through some sketchy side road? This is the aviation version, except the side road is a mountain. At the last possible second, the captain finally shouts, "Go around!" But physics does not care about late decisions. The engines spool up, nose pitches upward, power increases, but the 747 is too low. too slow and too close to the rising terrain. Seconds later, crash. The aircraft slams into the hillside, tearing through trees, bursting into flames. 229 people are killed instantly. Miraculously, 25 survive, crawling out of the wreckage in the middle of the darkness, surrounded by burning metal and jungle. When investigators arrive, the findings are brutal. The core mistakes. Captain believed the glide slope was functioning. It wasn't. Crew descended below the minimum altitude without runway in sight. GPWS alarms ignored. Poor communication and CRM. Fatigue impaired judgment. First officers too intimidated to directly challenge captain. Basically, 3 people in the cockpit, 0 actual teamwork. But the worst part? Korean Air had a culture at the time where the captain was treated like a king. No one questioned him, even when he was wrong, spectacularly wrong. Think of it as a group project where one guy insists on doing all the work and then forgets to submit it. After the crash, Korean Air changed everything. Crew training, communication culture, approach procedures, fatigue rules, hierarchy structure. The airline became dramatically safer in the years that followed. But the legacy of Flight 801 remains the same. A giant 747, perfectly functional, flown into a hill because 3 pilots combined their brain cells and somehow ended up with a negative number. And that's how one of the dumbest, most avoidable pilot mistakes in aviation history happened. A misunderstanding, a bad assumption, and a crew too polite or too tired to say, "Captain, we are not where you think we are." Number 3. It's 6 a.m. in Lexington, Kentucky. The sky is dark. The air is quiet. This is the time of day when most humans are still trying to remember how to stand up without falling over. Unfortunately, the crew of Comair Flight 5191 is about to attempt something much harder. Flying a jet in the same mental state you have before your first cup of coffee. August 27, 2006. A Bombardier CRJ-100 sits at Bluegrass Airport, ready to depart for Atlanta. The passengers are sleepy. The pilots are sleepy. The airport is sleepy. A perfect setup for chaos. Inside the cockpit, Captain Jeffrey Clay, experienced but tired. First Officer James Polhinky, even more tired. They're cleared for takeoff from runway 22, a long runway perfectly suitable for jets. But there's a tiny detail no one knows yet. They are absolutely not on runway 22. Instead, they've lined up on runway 26, a short, tiny, 4 small planes only. Do not use unless you want to meet Jesus runway. How short? Runway 22, 7,000 plus feet long. Runway 26, about 3,500 feet. In small aviation terms, that's the difference between safe takeoff and please start writing your will. How did they get to the wrong runway? Let's rewind. The taxiways at Bluegrass Airport had been changed and partly closed off for construction. Markings were confusing. Lights were confusing. Everybody was functioning on low battery mode. The tower controller was working alone, common at small airports at night, and the pilots were engaged in non-essential conversation. This is aviation's polite term for, "Bro, stop talking about the weekend, you're about to fly a plane." Instead of checking runway signs, they just kind of drifted, like a lost Uber driver, hoping the GPS eventually says, "You have arrived." When they visually lined up, the captain glanced ahead and saw a strip of pavement that looked like, well, a runway. And in their defense, it was a runway, just not the runway. Runway 26 had dim lights. It had a different heading. It had no centerline lighting. It was obviously not meant for jets. But inside the cockpit, nobody asked, "Wait, does this feel right?" Which is ironic because nothing felt right. Checklist complete. Throttles advanced. Engines roar. The CRJ-100 starts accelerating. 100 feet, 500 feet, 1,000 feet down the runway. The plane is using up this short strip faster than a kid tearing open a birthday present. Inside the cockpit, airspeed alive. Checks. V1. Rotate. The captain pulls back on the controls. The plane tries so hard to lift off. But physics leans in like, "Not today, buddy." The jet simply doesn't have enough runway. It barely lifts its nose, stalls, dips back down, smashes through the runway end lights, bounces across rough ground, and hits a tall berm of terrain just beyond the airport limits. The aircraft is torn apart. Fire erupts instantly. 49 of the 50 people on board die. The only survivor? The first officer, catastrophically injured, barely clinging to life. Investigators swarm the site, and what they discover becomes one of the clearest examples of pilot error in modern aviation. What went wrong? The dumb version, they used the wrong runway. They didn't verify signage. They didn't cross-check instruments. Taxi instructions were shallow. They distracted themselves with casual conversation. The controller didn't visually confirm the runway because he was busy with other duties. No one noticed the runway lights didn't match. No one noticed the heading didn't match. No one noticed the runway length was half what it should have been. If there was ever a crash caused by a series of "come on, guys" moments, this was it. The dark irony. The flight crew had every tool to prevent the mistake: the heading indicator, the airport diagram, their own eyeballs, a literal painted sign that said runway 26, but they didn't check any of them. Because humans, when tired, often fall into the deadliest trap of all: assumption. They assumed they were where they were supposed to be. They assumed the darkness was normal. They assumed the runway was long enough. And as the NTSB later pointed out, the entire disaster could have been prevented by a 2-second glance at the instruments. But here's the real kicker. This crash happened at 6 a.m. Science shows pilots are biologically least alert between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. Meanwhile, airlines schedule early flights like, let's put them in a jet full of people and hope they're awake enough to notice a giant runway. Not ideal. After the incident, airports around the world changed runway lighting requirements, signage standards, and cockpit distraction rules. The aviation community basically said, okay, maybe we should make it harder to accidentally launch a jet from a toy runway. But for the victims' families and for the aviation world, Comair 5191 became a legendary case study in human error. A reminder that even the biggest mistakes often start with the tiniest lapses. A wrong turn, a sleepy crew, a dim runway, and the split-second belief that it'll be fine. And just like that, one of the dumbest, most preventable pilot errors in aviation history was written in fire across a Kentucky field. Number 4, it's early morning in Patna, India, July 17th, 2000. Humidity so thick you could drink the air. People waking up, markets opening, the usual routine. Nobody expects that a Boeing 737 is about to drop out of the sky like a confused brick. Least of all the passengers on board Alliance Air Flight 742, a short domestic hop that should have been boring, safe, forgettable. But instead, it becomes a masterclass in how not to fly an airplane. The flight is descending toward Patna Airport, a small airport surrounded by neighborhoods, traffic, buildings. Basically everything you wish wasn't next to a runway. Inside the cockpit sit 2 pilots who are about to demonstrate the rare art of turning a routine landing into one of the most baffling pilot error crashes in Indian aviation history. As they approach the runway, the crew realizes something. They're too high, way too high. Like, this landing is not going to happen unless gravity gives us a coupon, high. Normally, when a pilot sees this, they do the obvious thing. Go around. Try again. No big deal, but not these guys. Instead, they decide to force the landing by doing a sharp, last-second maneuver. Because why choose safety when you can choose style? They call ATC and request a 360-degree turn to lose altitude. Yes, a full circle, in a commercial jet, on short final. Over a dense city, that's like missing your exit on the highway and deciding to do a full U-turn in the middle of traffic. But the controller approves it, and that's when the fun begins. The pilots roll into the turn. The engines are at idle. Speed starts bleeding off. Airspeed indicators dropping like a stock market crash. Inside the cockpit, a loud vibrating alarm suddenly triggers, "Buzz! Buzz! Buzz!" The stick shaker is going off, the airplane's way of screaming, "Hey geniuses, you are stalling!" When a plane stalls, the nose must be pushed down and thrust added immediately. Clear, basic, day one flight school stuff. So what does the crew do? They retract the flaps. Let me repeat that. The pilots are stalling, and they decide to reduce lift even more. This is the aviation equivalent of slipping on ice and deciding the best solution is removing your shoes. With the flaps coming up, the airplane's nose rises even further, the speed drops even lower, and the stall deepens. Passengers have no idea what's happening. Some think they're landing. Some think it's turbulence. Some are asleep. Meanwhile, the crew is panicking, fumbling with controls, pulling random levers like they're trying to fix a TV remote that won't work. The engines remain at idle. Because in all the chaos, nobody pushes the throttles forward. The Boeing 737 is now fully stalled, wings wobbling, nose high, sinking like a slow-motion falling elevator. But the cockpit, still trying to regain altitude, while adding zero power. One of the pilots calls for a go-around, finally realizing the landing isn't happening, but a go-around requires thrust. The engines remain quiet. It's too late. The aircraft drops below the rooftops. A desperate, useless surge of power comes at the last moment. But jet engines are like your friend who always shows up late to the party. They need time to wake up, and time has run out. Seconds later, crash. The Boeing slams into a residential neighborhood behind the airport. Homes collapse, metal tears open, fire erupts like a volcanic blast. People on the ground barely have time to react. The scene becomes a nightmare. Flames spreading across rooftops, burning fuel flooding the street. Black smoke filling the sky, screams from survivors inside the wreckage. The impact kills almost everyone on board and several people living in the houses. Rescue teams rush in. Firefighters try to fight both an aircraft fire and a building fire at the same time, and neighbors pull survivors out with their bare hands. Later, investigators piece together the disaster. And what they find is jaw-dropping. The core dumb mistakes. The plane was too high for landing. Pilots attempted a 360-degree maneuver instead of a go-around. They flew the turn at idle thrust. They ignored stall warnings. They retracted flaps during an active stall. They didn't follow any stall recovery procedure. They panicked and acted against training. This is the aviation version of someone trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline at it. Investigators were stunned. How could two trained pilots make so many basic errors in under 20 seconds? The answer: a lethal combination of fatigue, poor training, confusion, and cockpit chaos. It became a landmark case in India, a reminder that even a simple landing can go catastrophically wrong when pilots ignore warnings and rely on instinct instead of procedure. A stall shouldn't happen on approach. A stalled plane should never have flaps retracted, and a 360-degree turn at low altitude should never happen, ever. But Alliance Air 7412 broke every rule and paid the price. In the end, it wasn't weather, sabotage, or mechanical failure. It was humans. Humans who forgot the basics. Humans who panicked. Humans who tried to improvise when improvisation was the last thing needed. And that's why Flight 7412 sits high on the list of the dumbest pilot mistakes in aviation history. A tragic lesson burned into the memory of Indian aviation. Number 5. Picture this: a cold November evening in Estonia. Dark clouds, freezing winds. The kind of weather where even birds go, "Yeah, no thanks, we're staying home today." But flying through this miserable soup is ELK Airways Flight 1007, an Antonov An-28, bouncing through turbulence on its way to Kerdla Airport. A short hop, a simple route, nothing dramatic. Except the two pilots steering the airplane are about to make a decision so profoundly dumb. It feels like a deleted scene from a disaster comedy. On board are 17 people, business travelers, locals, a few tourists, all expecting to land safely and go on with their quiet Estonian evening. They do not expect to be introduced to a forest at high speed. As the aircraft approaches Hiiumaa Island, the weather worsens, mist thickens, visibility drops. Ice crystals cling to the windshield like nature's version of "you shall not pass." At this point, any sane crew would stick to a strict instrument approach. Let the instruments guide you. Trust the glide path. Follow the altitude restrictions. Survive. But the crew of ELK 1007, they look at this freezing darkness and think, let's fly visually. Visually, as in with their eyes, through clouds, through fog, through icing, at night. It's like trying to drive with your headlights off because you kind of know the way. They disengage from the safer instrument procedure and switch to the visual approach, even though the airport is surrounded by forested terrain and hills. The decision makes zero sense. But hey, why follow aviation training when you can freestyle? The aircraft begins descending, lower and lower and lower. Except there's one small issue. They can't see the runway. They can't see the ground. They can't see anything. But the pilots continue descending anyway, as if the runway might magically appear like a YouTube ad you can't skip. Inside the cockpit, they're chatting casually, searching for any sign of the airport lights. The windscreen is icing over. Clouds are swirling. Night is swallowing everything. Still no runway. Still descending. Meanwhile, the altimeter, the instrument literally designed to prevent "hey, we're about to hit something" moments, is ticking down. 600 feet, 500 feet, 400 feet. Still no visuals. But the crew? They're committed. They're going to land visually, even if it kills them. And that phrase becomes prophecy. As the plane drops below 300 feet, the world outside is just pitch black nothingness. Suddenly, trees, giant pines erupt out of the darkness like living spears. The pilots gasp, yank the controls, and try to climb, but it's too late. The aircraft smashes through treetops, metal tearing, branches ripping through the fuselage, the An-28 losing parts like a Lego set being kicked across the floor. The plane slams down in the forest. A sickening crunch echoes through the trees. Silence follows. Inside the cabin, chaos. Seats torn loose, passengers battered, shock everywhere. Miraculously, out of 17 people, 15 survive. Only 2 lose their lives. It's horrible, but considering the violence of the impact, it's a miracle. Rescuers rush in through the forest, finding the wreckage broken but not burned. Survivors stumble out, dazed, freezing, covered in blood, surrounded by darkness and snapped pine branches. Once investigators arrive, they ask the obvious question: why did you switch to visual flying when the weather looked like the opening scene of a horror movie? The cockpit voice recorder reveals the ugly truth. The crew believed they could spot the runway soon. They ignored instrument minimums. They descended below safe altitude without visual reference. They treated a non-visual environment like a sunny day. They let confirmation bias replace safety. Translation: they hoped for the best while descending blindly over forested terrain. The report is scathing. ELK Airways 1007 crashed because the pilots chose visual flying in non-visual conditions, ignored standard approach procedures. Failed to maintain altitude, thought they were lower than they really were, let situational awareness melt like ice on a hot grill. In aviation, descending below minimum altitude without seeing the runway is one of the biggest sins. Pilots drill this rule endlessly. No visual, no descent. But on this night, the crew ignored the mantra, and nearly everyone paid the price. After the crash, Estonian aviation authorities tightened procedures and training standards, particularly around situational awareness and instrument approaches. This incident became a case study in why gut feeling has no place in modern aviation. Imagine closing your eyes, sprinting downhill, and assuming there's a soft mattress waiting. That's ELK Airways 1007. In the end, the aircraft didn't fail. The weather didn't fail. The engines didn't fail. The humans did. Humans who made the deadly mistake of trusting their eyeballs in conditions where eyeballs are basically useless. And that's how Flight 1007 earned its spot among the dumbest, most baffling pilot decisions in aviation history. Proof that sometimes the worst danger in the sky is overconfidence. Number 6. It's February 19th, 1985, a cold winter morning in northern Spain. Clouds hang thick over the Basque Country, shrouding the hills in gray mist. The kind of weather where you should not, under any circumstances, descend blindly toward terrain. Unless, of course, you're the crew of Iberia Flight 610, a Boeing 727 with 148 people on board, all of whom assume the pilots understand that mountains are solid objects, not decorative scenery. The flight is en route from Madrid to Bilbao, a routine domestic hop. Just 55 minutes in the air, nothing fancy, no storms, no mechanical issues. Simple. But simple flights are where the greatest disasters hide, because pilots relax, get comfortable, and sometimes make decisions that feel less like aviation and more like improv theater. The approach into Bilbao is tricky. It involves mountains, narrow valleys, unpredictable wind, and often, surprise, low visibility. On this particular day, visibility is garbage, fog thick enough to audition for Silent Hill. So, naturally, the pilots decide to rely heavily on automation. Here comes the twist. The autopilot isn't doing what they think it's doing. During descent, pilots set something called altitude capture, a function where the autopilot levels off at a chosen altitude. So if you set it to 5,000 feet, the plane goes, "Okay, boss, stopping at 5,000. No problem." Except that only works if you actually activate it correctly. On Iberia 610, they didn't. The plane keeps descending and descending and descending, like a sleepy escalator with no supervision. Inside the cockpit, the captain and first officer are chatting, checking instruments, perfectly calm. Absolutely none of them realize the autopilot is not going to level off. Not at 5,000 feet, not at 3,000 feet, not at any altitude. The Boeing is headed straight toward Monte Huayz, a mountain that has existed for millions of years, not hidden, not new, not a pop-up obstacle. Yet somehow today, it has become invisible to the only two people who really needed to remember it was there. Bilbao ATC doesn't know the exact position of the plane. Radar coverage back then wasn't great in that region. So when they clear Iberia 610 for the approach, they assume the pilots will keep themselves above terrain. That's kind of important. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, one of the pilots casually remarks they're a bit high. Ironically, they are absolutely not high. They are catastrophically low. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, begins its polite beep, like, terrain, terrain. It's basically whispering, "Hey, maybe don't keep flying into the ground?" The pilots ignore it. The beeps get louder. Terrain, terrain. The crew casually silences the alarm, because nothing says professionalism like muting the airplane's desperate screaming. And seconds later, whoop whoop, pull up. The world outside is nothing but white fog and dense cloud. No runway lights, no horizon, no mountains. Even though one is right there. This is where, in any movie, a character would have a dramatic realization, a moment of clarity. But Iberia 610 isn't a movie. It's a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. The pilots still do not pull up because, and this is truly insane, they think the warning is a false alarm due to terrain proximity, but believe they are above the mountain, not directly on a collision course with it. The plane continues descending, oblivious, unstoppable. Then, out of the mist appears a massive TV transmission antenna on Monte Huayz. The impact is instantaneous. The left wing smashes into the antenna, shearing off metal, spiraling the aircraft into a catastrophic roll. The plane breaks apart in seconds. Debris scatters across the mountainside. A fireball erupts. There are no survivors. The crash is so violent, hikers miles away report seeing bright flashes through the fog. Emergency crews take hours to reach the wreckage due to terrain and weather. When investigators arrive, what they discover almost defies belief. The core dumb mistakes. The crew set the autopilot altitude selector but did not activate capture mode. They believed altitude capture was engaged. They descended below all published minimum altitudes. They ignored GPWS terrain warnings until seconds before impact. They silenced the alarm, aviation equivalent of muting a fire alarm. They misread altitude and assumed they were clear of terrain. They failed to cross-check with charts that clearly showed the mountain. Basically, the airplane thought it should keep descending, and the pilots thought the airplane should stop descending, and neither side checked in with the other. This was a fatal case of automation complacency, which is aviation speak for, I thought the computer was doing the thing that I was supposed to do. The investigation also uncovered cultural issues at the time. Over-reliance on automation. Poor crew communication, weak challenge culture. Co-pilots hesitated to correct the captain. High-pressure scheduling with little margin for error. But the biggest mistake was simple. They forgot the mountain was there. And they trusted the autopilot more than their own instruments. In the years after, Spain overhauled approach procedures, terrain awareness systems improved, and pilots worldwide received better training on automation and altitude management. But Iberia Flight 610 still stands as a chilling reminder. Even the safest skies become deadly when humans get comfortable. Ignore warnings and trust a machine to think for them. And that's how one of the dumbest, most avoidable pilot mistakes in Spain's aviation history ended in tragedy. A direct collision with a mountain that was on every chart, every briefing, every map, and just not on the minds of the pilots who needed to avoid it. Number 7. It's August 20th, 2008, a blisteringly hot afternoon in Madrid. Summer haze ripples across the runway like a giant oven set to extra crispy. Travelers sweat, air conditioners groan, and in the cockpit of a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, two pilots are about to redefine the phrase, human error. This is Spanair Flight 522, scheduled to head from Madrid Barajas to Gran Canaria, a simple, sunny island hop. But nothing about this takeoff is going to be simple or sunny. Let's rewind. Earlier in the day, the plane attempted its first departure, but the pilots noticed a temperature probe fault. ATC canceled the takeoff. They returned to the gate. Mechanics fixed the sensor by pulling a circuit breaker, which will become very important later. Passengers waited on the baking hot tarmac for nearly an hour while the crew reset everything. Now, normally, when a flight has already been aborted once, the next attempt becomes double careful, double checklist, double everything. Spanair 522, not so much. After the delay, the crew restarts the checklists. Or at least, they believe they restart them. But the MD-82 is a strange beast. It's an older design, full of quirky switches, and demands absolute attention. One of the most vital items before takeoff, extend the flaps. The flaps give the aircraft lift at low speeds. Without them, the jet will accelerate, but will not climb. It will behave like a very expensive shopping cart. Every checklist in the world screams this: flaps, slats, check, confirm, verify. But on this fateful afternoon, while juggling frustrations, heat, delays, and cockpit stress, the crew somehow forgets. They leave the flaps fully retracted. Inside the cockpit's quiet hum, a flaps not set MD-82 should trigger a loud warning horn during takeoff roll. A giant, "Hey, stop, you cannot fly like this" alarm. But remember that circuit breaker the mechanics pulled earlier? Yeah. That breaker also disabled the takeoff warning system. The plane now has no flaps and no alarm to remind the pilots they have no flaps. A perfect storm is brewing, and nobody knows it. The aircraft lines up on runway 36L, the second attempt at departure. Passengers settle in, sweating in the August heat. Some whisper prayers, not because they sense danger, but because the plane is boiling inside. Throttles advance, engines roar, the MD-82 accelerates. 100 knots, Yun 10, 120, 30. The runway is disappearing behind them in a blur. Inside the cockpit, everything sounds normal. Nothing feels wrong. The captain calls, V1. They reach rotation speed and the captain pulls back on the controls. The nose lifts, but the aircraft doesn't. It struggles. It shakes. The wings are screaming for lift they physically cannot produce. The MD-82 makes one last desperate attempt to climb, wobbles into the air for a brief second, just long enough to give everyone false hope, then slams back down onto the runway. The plane veers left. A wing strikes the ground. Metal screeches. The jet barrels off the runway, tearing through lights, grass, and concrete. It becomes airborne again only because it hits a slope. Not lift, not engines, just the cruel physics of momentum. The MD-82 rises 10 feet, 15, 20. Then one wing clips the ground. The plane cartwheels, breaks apart like paper, erupts in flames, and disintegrates into a field near the airport perimeter. 154 of the 172 people on board perish. It is one of the worst aviation accidents in Spain's history. Now begins the investigation. And what emerges is a chilling chain of errors. The dumb mistakes in order of oh no, flaps and slats not extended. This is aviation kindergarten. Without them, the MD-82 cannot fly. Checklist not properly completed. The crew believe they ran the checklist, but they likely rushed or skipped items in the confusion after returning to the gate. Takeoff warning horn disabled. Because the mechanics pulled a circuit breaker for a different system, the warning horn also lost power. This was documented in obscure manual footnotes, but not known by line mechanics. No cross-check of flap lever position. In a cockpit, two people look at the lever, call it out, confirm it, but not today. Crew stress and fatigue. It was hot, delayed, frustrating, and they'd already aborted once. Bad mindset for careful flying. Poor cockpit communication. The first officer did not strongly challenge missing items. The final timeline is horrifying. The plane accelerated normally. The pilots thought everything was fine, and they only realized something was wrong when the laws of physics punched them in the face. Imagine trying to take off in a car with no tires. That's Spanair 5022. The investigators' conclusion was blunt. If the flaps had been extended, the aircraft would have taken off normally. No mechanical fault, no sabotage, no weather disaster, just human beings failing to follow the checklist and failing to notice the plane was not configured for flight. It's the purest form of dumb pilot error, amplified by a warning system that conveniently decided to take the day off. After the crash, airlines around the world changed procedures, extra checks, redundant warnings, better training, better maintenance oversight. But the victims' families still ask the same question investigators did. How do you forget the flaps? And there is no comforting answer. Sometimes the deadliest mistake is so simple, so obvious, that it hides in plain sight until it's too late. That's why Spanair 5022 earns its place among the dumbest, most avoidable pilot mistakes in aviation history. Proof that even in modern aviation, one skipped step can bring down an entire jet. Number 8, Irkutsk, Russia, July 9, 2006. Freezing cold even in summer, with a runway so slick and short it makes pilots sweat before they even land. Into this icy arena comes S7 Airlines Flight 778, an Airbus A310 carrying 203 people who think they're minutes away from a safe landing. Instead, they're about to witness a cockpit mistake so chaotic, it feels like slapstick comedy written by fate. The aircraft begins its approach at night. Visibility? Bad? Runway conditions? Worst? Pilot awareness? Deeply questionable. Inside the cockpit, the captain, experienced but fatigued, the car is focused on greasing the landing. The first officer is handling radio calls. Everything seems normal. The plane touches down. And immediately, everything goes wrong. On the Airbus A310, after landing, pilots do this: pull both thrust levers into reverse, deploy spoilers, activate brakes, stop plane, celebrate with coffee. Simple, right? Well, the captain pulls the right engine into reverse. Good. But the left throttle, he accidentally pushes it forward. So forward, as in takeoff power, while landing. So now the plane is doing something no airplane should ever do. One engine screaming, stop, the other engine screaming, let's go, baby. This creates asymmetric thrust, meaning the jet wants to spin like a carnival ride. The aircraft violently pulls left. The passengers feel the plane lurch sideways. The engines roar unevenly, one sounding like a vacuum cleaner dying, the other like a chainsaw waking up. Inside the cockpit, confusion erupts. What's happening? We're veering! More brakes! Reverse! But nobody checks the thrust levers, the source of the chaos. They slam on the brakes. No effect. They try to straighten the plane. Not happening. They deploy spoilers. Still sliding. Runway rushing past them like a horror movie fast forward. Now imagine trying to park your car while your friend next to you is flooring the gas pedal. That's what's happening at 140 km/h. Finally, the captain shouts, "Go around!" This is the aviation equivalent of abort, abort, reverse the mistake. But physics has already loaded the consequences. A go-around requires lift. Lift requires speed. Speed requires runway. And runway requires, well, physical existence. There is none left. The Airbus skids off the runway, plows into the grass, then smashes into a line of concrete garages near the airport. The plane breaks apart. A massive fireball erupts. Silence follows, broken only by shouting, alarms, and the roar of burning fuel. Of 203 passengers and crew, 125 die. The survivors crawl out of broken fuselage sections into the freezing night, bleeding, covered in smoke, surrounded by burning metal. Rescue workers rush in, fighting both cold and flames as they search for survivors trapped between melted aluminum and collapsed garage roofs. When investigators arrive, the question on everyone's mind: how does a pilot mix up the throttles during landing? The cockpit chaos explained. Unlike modern Airbus designs, the A310's throttles are older, mechanical-style levers. They sit side by side. They're nearly identical, and they require precise, synchronized control. In the heat of landing, with runway slick plane bouncing alarms chiming stress high visibility low, one wrong push becomes disaster. The captain intended to pull both levers into reverse. Instead, left lever sang forward, takeoff power, right lever, reverse. This meant the left engine shoved the plane forward, the right engine dragged it backward. The plane twisted like a broken shopping cart. And the worst part? The crew didn't notice for nearly 8 seconds, which is an eternity during landing roll. Why? Because the cockpit was full of distractions. Shouting, bad weather, sudden skid, loss of visibility, alarm confusion, overriding muscle memory. By the time they checked the instruments, the aircraft was already screaming off the runway like a bowling ball. The investigation's biggest facepalm moments. The crew failed to monitor thrust lever position. Basic, essential, skipped. No one noticed asymmetric thrust until too late. Crew coordination broke down instantly. The captain attempted a go-around after landing. Something that requires runway length, which they no longer had. Fatigue played a major role. Runway contamination made everything worse. But the most shocking finding? This entire crash started from a single wrong hand movement. One wrong push on the wrong lever at the worst possible time. That tiny mistake unleashed a catastrophic chain reaction that tore apart a plane and cost 125 lives. The dark irony. The A310's design had been criticized for years. No mechanical lock preventing accidental forward thrust. Poor ergonomic differentiation. Known human factor risks, and Flight 778 became the tragic example everyone had feared. But the final report was blunt. The ultimate cause was pilot error, a single human mistake, amplified by stress, multiplied by poor communication, exploded by icy runway conditions. After the crash, Airbus and airlines updated procedures, training, and cockpit layouts to prevent asymmetric thrust during landing ever happening again. But nothing would change the fact that on that cold night in Irkutsk, one pilot accidentally told one engine, "Stop," and the other engine, "Full send." And that contradiction turned a routine landing into a fiery tragedy, curing Flight 778's place among the dumbest, most avoidable pilot errors in aviation. History. Number 9. It's 1:30 a.m. in Guam. Warm tropical air. A light drizzle. Fog drifting across the island like lazy ghosts. While most of the island sleeps, Korean Air Flight 801, a Boeing 747-300, slices through the night sky carrying 254 people who think they're only minutes away from landing, checking into hotels, and collapsing into bed. Instead, they are minutes away from one of the deadliest, most baffling examples of pilot confidence meets zero visibility in history. The flight from Seoul has been long, tiring, and delayed. The captain, a 42-year-old pilot with thousands of hours, is exhausted. The first officer seems hesitant and quiet. The flight engineer sits behind them, reading checklists, occasionally chiming in. This crew is tired. Fatigue is whispering in their ears. And fatigue is dangerous because tired pilots tend to trust systems that aren't actually working. Let's begin the mistake. The glide slope is out of service. Has been for months. There are NOTAMs, warnings, paperwork, briefings, everything. What's missing? The captain's awareness. As the giant 747 approaches Guam through thick clouds, the crew begins its descent using a non-precision approach. That means no glide slope, just altitudes and timing. But almost instantly, the captain starts flying as if the glide slope is working anyway. This is the aviation version of trying to follow GPS directions when the phone is dead. Staring at the screen, waiting for it to magically come back to life. Inside the cockpit, silence thickens. The captain mutters about being tired. The first officer agrees. Nobody challenges anything. Crew resource management, the polite teamwork system that keeps flights safe, is now officially asleep, still descending, still no visual contact with the runway. Still in heavy cloud, the ground proximity warning system, a GPWS, gives a gentle beep. Caution, terrain. A warning, a soft nudge, a polite throat clear. The captain brushes it off. The 747 continues descending, below minimum altitude, into thicker fog, closer to the rising terrain west of the airport. This is where the first officer should speak up. He doesn't. This is where the flight engineer should say something. He does, faintly. He says, "Captain, is glide slope working?" The captain responds with total confidence, "Yes, yes, it's working." Narrator, it was not working. It was, in fact, famously and extremely not working. But tired minds don't want complexity. They want autopilot. They want the computer to take care of everything. The rain intensifies. Visibility worsens. Cloud cover thickens. The 747 drops below 800 feet. The GPWS speaks again, louder this time. "Terrain! Terrain!" The first officer says nothing. The captain ignores it. The flight engineer says softly, "Sir, pull up." The captain still does not pull up. Why? Because in his mind, the glide slope is alive, accurate, guiding him safely. Even though reality is screaming that it's offline, bro, wake up. Now the jet drops below 600 feet. Still no runway, still in cloud, still descending. GPWS loses its patience. "Whoop, whoop, pull up!" This is the airplane yelling, "You are about to hit something very solid." But the captain thinks the alarm is faulty, triggered by terrain near the airport, not by danger. This single misunderstanding seals the flight's fate. The first officer finally mutters, "Sir, we have to go." Too late. The 747 bursts out of the fog and straight toward Nimitz Hill, a densely forested rising slope a few miles short of the runway. The pilots have exactly 2 seconds to react. 2. The captain yells, "Go around!" Slams the throttles forward. Pulls back on the controls, but the aircraft is too low, too slow, too close. The hill is right there. The 747's belly slams into the terrain, ripping open like a giant aluminum zipper. Wings tear off. Fuel ignites. The aircraft explodes into a fireball that lights up the entire hillside. The crash kills 229 people instantly. Miraculously, 25 survive, crawling out of the shattered fuselage into jungle darkness, flames lighting up the sky behind them. When investigators arrive, they uncover a disaster made entirely of bad decisions. The dumb, deadly mistakes. Captain believed glideslope was working. It was not. Crew descended below minimum altitude without runway in sight. GPWS warnings ignored repeatedly. Fatigue severely impaired judgment. First officer failed to challenge captain forcefully. Crew resource management broke down completely. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This wasn't weather sabotage. This wasn't a lightning strike. This was human error, multiplied by exhaustion, multiplied by terrible communication, multiplied by blind faith in systems that were literally turned off. The dark irony. The one piece of information that could have saved them. Glideslope out of service was ignored. Why? Because the captain believed his experience was enough to override reality. But airplanes don't care about confidence. Airplanes care about numbers, altitude, glide path, procedures. The cockpit didn't follow them, so the plane didn't survive them. Today, Korean Air 801 remains one of the most infamous examples of pilot error in history. A crash that never needed to happen, caused by a crew who trusted a go signal and descended into a hill with absolute conviction. And that's why this story completes the list. The final chapter in the dumbest pilots in history. A reminder that confidence means nothing if the glide slope is off. And there you have it. 9 pilot decisions so spectacularly bad, they make you question how humanity ever convinced gravity to cooperate in the first place. From mistaking mountains for clouds, to taking off without flaps, to trusting autopilot like it's a guardian angel on salary. These weren't mechanical failures, or freak storms, or hidden dangers. These were human moments when exhaustion, ego, overconfidence, and pure, I think it's fine energy teamed up to create disasters that should never have happened. If there's one lesson here, it's simple. Airplanes don't fall out of the sky because they're complicated. They fall because someone in the cockpit thinks, hey, it'll sort itself out. But hey, you survived this flight through human stupidity, and you didn't even need a seatbelt. If you want more darkly funny deep dives into the moments where humans go full brain-off mode, you know what to do. Hit that like button so the algorithm doesn't stall like these pilots. Subscribe to Factoland before someone else forgets their flaps. And tell me in the comments which story blew your mind the most, or which disaster you want next. Because here at Factoland, we're always boarding the next flight into human absurdity. No ticket needed, no turbulence surcharge, just stupidity at 35,000 feet. I'll see you in the next one. Safe travels, and maybe say a quick prayer for your next pilot.